Well, I'm delighted to be invited here. I've just been here for 3 months, so I'm very new to the state of Utah, to Salt Lake City, and I'm just delighted at the connections that we can make with some of the faculty that are here, and also hopefully some of the students that will see Utah State University not so very far away from the University of Utah, and vice versa. Sam introduced me with a number of my qualifications, but one of the ones that he was not aware of, I guess, is that when I was in high school, I was in the Latin Scrabble Club. And so, you know, that just candidate for geekhood right here. But what it has left me with, in addition to a couple of trophies in my living room from high school, is a desire and a kind of a proclivity for understanding the words that I deal with in order to really get what they're about. And so today I'd like to really talk about 4 words that I think are relevant to what I do, but also hopefully, at least in part, what you do. And that is science, which comes from the Latin word scio, which means to know to the fullest extent possible. So if you're a scientist, that's what you're about. You're trying to know to the fullest extent possible. Research comes from the old French rechercher, which means to look for again and again. So when I tell you about my research, or you think about doing research with one of these faculty, you can think about that process of looking for something again and again, which I think is truth. I think we're trying to learn about the truth of our world, but we have to keep at it. We have to keep doing it. The third word is education, which comes from the Latin ex ducere, which means to lead out from one place to another, from darkness to light, from ignorance to being knowledgeable, all of those things that we do here in a place like Utah State University. And the last one is one of my favorite words, which is synergism, which comes from the Greek, actually, syn and ergon. Ergon means work, and syn means together. So work that works together. And when I get to my public outreach programs, I think you'll see that that was the mentality behind them, which is about working together. So keep these words in mind as I go through my talk. I thought I'd also give you a little bit of my own background, my personal background, because it comes to bear in the work that I have chosen to do. These are my parents. This is my father, Mareshwar Nadkarni. He came from India. He died about 8 years ago. He was a scientist, a pharmacologist, quiet, tall, dignified man. And this is my mother, Goldie Nadkarni, born Goldie Pechenuk. She's an Orthodox Jew from Brooklyn, New York. She was born of Russian immigrants. And so you can see that my own influences as a small child were really about mixing things up, about knitting things together, whether it was the culture of my parents and the religion of my parents, or my curiosity about nature and art. And this is a picture of me when I was 5 or 6 years old. And even at that time, I was very, very interested in trees. Trees and forests. I had no idea that I could actually make my living by studying trees, but as a kid, that passion was in my heart, it was in my mind, it was in my body as I would climb trees after school, and it really, I've been fortunate in that it has persisted into my adult life and my profession in terms of carrying out research, understanding the science, wanting to do education in a synergistic way, with the central focus being trees. A lot of my work has gone on in forests, and when I climb trees, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute, and look out on a forest, I see not just one element, but I see many elements kind of woven together. And in fact, when I look at forests, I really see kind of a tapestry of species, of interactions, of colors, of forms, of ways of living that the plants and animals have evolved to live in something as complex as a tropical rainforest. And I'll just bring this little piece of poetry to you as a start. An Indian poet named Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote that the tapestry of life's story is woven with the threads of life's ties, ever breaking and joining. And it's that breaking and joining and that interacting, that knitting together of a tapestry that I'd like to use as kind of a theme in today's talk, that a tapestry consists really, or is created by a strong loom. The tapestry that I study is really kind of the loom of academia, the strong frame that we get when we come to a place like USU or University of Utah, but also that it's put together, it's very strong, put together with different threads going in different directions but intertwining. So it creates something that is strong, that is complex, but that is also beautiful. But we also have to think about its fragility. If we treat this badly, if we burn it, if we don't take care of it, then even a strong tapestry can fall upon hard times. So that's kind of the theme I'd like to talk about today, is how the tapestry of knowledge of different disciplines of science and culture need to be wrapped together in order to understand the tapestry of the forest and to communicate it, that is, to weave that information into society. The way I'd like to do this is first to tell you a little bit about my own forest canopy research, then talk about how I communicate this research to others, and finally, using that synergistic word, thinking about how a scientist who does outreach can also gain something from the audiences and the participants that he or she works with. So forest canopies. Well, when I was growing up and when I was actually a graduate student at the University of Washington, people tended to look at forests like this. They tended to walk along the ground, they put out transects, they made measurements on the sort of the bottom part of the forest, sort of the benthos of the whole forest, and basically kind of ignored what was going on in the forest canopy. Obviously, it was difficult to get into the canopy. You know, we've unfortunately lost our prehensile tails over evolutionary times, and so getting into the canopy itself has always been difficult. But I and a few other people who kind of had this sense that there was something going on in the canopy said, you know, we really need to get up into the forest canopy, just as marine biologists utilized the scuba gear to get themselves down into the benthos of the ocean to see what was going on in the environment of the ocean floor. So forest canopy researchers really need to get into the canopy in order to understand what this roof of the forest is doing, the microenvironment, the animals and plants that live there, and the interactions of the canopy with the forest as a whole. And getting into the canopy, I mean, that's, you know, if you're a tree climber, you understand that that's really like the funnest part, the big feature of doing canopy work. And I'll just say that that was one of the motivating things, was that I really just like climbing trees. It wasn't the only thing, but it was definitely there. And when you're a scientist, it's a really great thing to be able to enjoy what you do as you do that difficult looking over and over for the truth of what you're studying. So I thought I would just take a minute and show you the way that I get into the forest canopy using mountain climbing techniques. And this is a little clip from a National Geographic film that actually won the Emmy Award for Best Documentary Film in the year 2000, and it's called Heroes of the High Frontier. So if I can figure out how to switch the programs.
The combination slingshot fishing pole is Nadkarni's own invention for shooting a line 100 feet up.
Yes.
Accuracy is essential to get that all-important first line up over a limb. A climbing rope is hauled up, to which she attaches her Jumar ascenders. She's been entrusting her life to this gear for 19 years.
I realized at that moment, that first rope climb, I knew where I was going for the rest of my life. I was going up to the canopy. So how many people here would like to go into canopy studies right now? Yes, that's right. Great. So that's sort of one way to get up into the forest canopy. It's not the only way, and it's really come to the point where people have kind of solved the problems of getting into the forest canopy by using construction cranes. There are now 16 large construction cranes that have been installed around the world temperate rainforests, tropical forests, where you can actually get access to that whole three-dimensional volume of the forest as a whole. People use hot air balloons to get access to the forest canopy. As you might imagine, this is a French research group that started the use of hot air balloons. So really, getting into the forest canopy now is not the challenge that it was just 30 years ago, and we really do have fantastic access into this rainforest roof. Well, if you were to climb with me on that National Geographic climb up there, and we would sit on this branch over here together, this is the same tree, by the way, what I think you would notice right away is the microclimate. It's the fact that there's a lot more sunlight coming into that branch than there was on the forest floor below. There's a lot more wind. When we make measurements of the microclimate of the canopy, we see that there are much greater extremes of relative humidity and of temperature. So that microenvironment, those conditions, as well as just the topology of what the canopy is, that it's a bunch of cylinders suspended in 3 dimensions in a 3-dimensional volume of airspace, those conditions, those different conditions in the forest canopy have given rise to a whole set of arboreal animals and plants, some of which never come down to the forest floor, and all of which have adaptations for canopy life, like holding on really tightly to branches so that they don't fall down. This is a 3-toed sloth from Panama, a very common canopy animal, but there are other animals that have more or more subtle canopy adaptations. So we have something like the olinga, which is an arboreal mammal that has a prehensile tail. We have pollinator hummingbirds that move from flower to flower very quickly. We have some snakes, arboreal snakes, that are very adept at curling themselves around very, very fine structures of twigs in the forest canopy that allow them to be the sit-and-wait predators that they are. We have lots of canopy animals, including invertebrates, very diverse. Thousands and thousands of species are yet to be discovered. And some of these are brilliantly colored and just beautiful insects. And some of them, like this one, are sort of less flashy. But I chose to show you this one because my husband is an ant taxonomist. That means he studies and collects and names ants. And when we got married 28 years ago, he promised that he would name an ant after me, and he finally did so. And so this is Procryptoceras nailini, which is a canopy-dwelling ant, as he says, an elegant canopy-dwelling ant that occurs in Costa Rica. And we've since had 2 kids, and so he's named ants after our children as well, August and Erica, and he's had ants named after him, of course. So we're probably the only family in the world for which everybody has an ant named after them. So that's one of the great benefits of being a researcher and a scientist, is you get to have a family full of people with eponymous names. In any case, although those animals I think are really fascinating and really wonderful, and lots of people are studying them, it is the canopy-dwelling plants that for whatever reason have captured my imagination. So the epiphytes, epi means upon, phyte means plant. So an epiphyte is any plant that lives on another plant, a tree. So these are called bromeliads. This is from Jamaica. So they sit perched on these trees. Their roots do not go into the host tree vasculature. So the roots are, this isn't like mistletoes that are parasites. They simply get the benefit of being perched up there in the sun, and they get their nutrients from rainwater, from dust that settles down, and from intercepted foliage that comes down and gets stuck there. In the tropics, we have a tremendous diversity of these epiphytic plants, both vascular and non-vascular. In temperate rainforests, such as in the Pacific Northwest where I lived before I came here, almost all of those epiphytes are non-vascular plants. They're mosses, they're lichens, liverworts, and so they sort of have a different evolutionary history, but they share this common habit, which is to derive support but not nutrients from their hosts. And over the last 25 or 30 years, I've spent a lot of time in 2 places, the Olympic National Park in the Pacific Northwest and in the tropical cloud forest of Monteverde, Costa Rica, trying to understand to the fullest possible extent what is going on with these plants that live in the forest canopy. Who are they? How are they distributed? How do they respond to disturbance? And to me, most interestingly, how do they relate to the forest as a whole? How are they connected to the forest as a whole? What are their ecological roles in this forest? One of the things, I'll just tell you a few things that I've learned in the last 20 years, and I'd be happy to tell you more, that epiphytes are very important in terms of the cycling of water and nutrients in these very wet systems. And the way that we study that is to study the nutrient inputs that can come in rain. Every raindrop, every droplet of mist has as its center a tiny speck of dust which has nutrients in it, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and magnesium and calcium, all these macronutrients that plants and animals need. And that little speck of dust has a little bit of water that's condensed around it. And as you get more and more water condensing around this little speck of dust, it gets heavy enough to fall to the ground. And that's what rainfall is. That's what mist is. And so when you think about it, that rainfall, that mist, is really like a dilute soup of nutrients. And many of these epiphytic plants are well adapted to take up those nutrients through their leaves, through their little roots, and that's where they get the bulk of their nutrients. Not from the floor, they don't have roots that go down to the ground, not from the tree, but rather from outside sources. So they capture nutrients from outside sources, they store it in their biomass for some length of time. Those nutrients then get transferred when they fall down to the forest floor and decompose, and those nutrients then become subject to uptake by other members of the ecosystem. So in terms of this ecosystem process of nutrient cycling then, in these very wet forests where mist and fog are very important components of the climate, epiphytes are a very strong agent in terms of increasing the number of epiphytes or the number of nutrients that are there and circulating it within the system. As I mentioned, the water is really an important part of this nutrient cycling story, but we can also think about the importance of water cycling as well. So it's not just nutrients, it's really this paired combination of nutrients and water. Other ways that epiphytes provide or contribute to the forest as a whole is through providing nutrients and water for other animals, like hummingbirds, like this emerald toucanet, in terms of the sugars that are provided in nectar in plants when they pollinate. They're pollinated by something like this hummingbird, or as this bird is distributing, taking in this food, getting the nutrients, getting the sugars, and moving those seeds around. So epiphytes, again, provide, in some cases, up to a third of the resources, the fruit and flower resources that are provided to the bird and mammal fauna within a particular forest. So given that, and I've just gone through this very briefly, epiphytes, I think, can be considered what we call keystone elements of forests. You know what a keystone is? When you have an arch and you have that one central stone right there, even though it's a small piece of the arch as a whole, it has a disproportionate importance value because of its position of holding everything together. So ecologists talk about keystone elements as those elements within a forest that are small in proportion to the forest as a whole. Epiphytes constitute only about 5% of the biomass of these forests, but their ecological importance is far larger than what their small biomass would suggest. So if that is true, in fact, if they are keystone elements, then one question that immediately comes up, at least to me, is, well, what happens when you disturb these epiphytes? What happens when there's some physical disturbance or some environmental disturbance that might negatively affect these very important plants? So I started doing some experiments about actually almost 30 years ago, where I removed mats of epiphytes, all of them, the live plants, the soils underneath them, just remove them all, and I just said, well, I'm going to see how long it takes these guys to come back. And I predicted, because they're so lush in a forest like this one in Costa Rica, that number one, they would come back very quickly, and number two, they would probably encroach from the side. They'd probably sort of like grow into that, the way lawn can sort of grow into a sidewalk. Well, I came back the next year, and nothing had grown back. Second year, third year, fifth year, 8th year, 10th year, 12th year. It wasn't until 12 years, these are some data, that I saw epiphytes actually coming back. So here's where I did the epiphyte stripping. This is the percent cover. And you can see then that it's 12 or 13 years later that you start getting epiphytes growing back. What was really weird is that they weren't growing back from the sides. They started growing back from the bottom. So there was this like green scuzz after 12 years, and over the subsequent years, that green scuzz turned into sort of green mosses and finally vascular plants. And now, and it's only been, and 22 years, we only have 40% recovery. So it's still going to take a long time for these epiphytes to regain their former glory. And this is the way I like to think about it and tell people about it is, and maybe some of you can relate to this, when it's gone, it is gone. And if you're really lucky, you might get some epiphytes growing, from the bottom up, trying to cover that up. And, it's sort of funny, and I can laugh about this, but what it means goes back to the tapestry analog I was telling you about, that when we disturb these epiphytes, when we change physically, the nature of these epiphytes through some sort of human or natural disturbance, we have a system that is fragile. It looks strong, it looks complex, but there can be kind of subtle or hidden fragilities, and I'd like you to keep that in mind as well. Of course, one of the disturbances that is going on all over the world, and in particular in tropical montane forests like in Costa Rica where I've been working, is the specter of global climate change. And one of the things that's been predicted for climate change in the tropical montane forests of the world is that dry seasons are going to get drier and longer, that these plants that live in the canopy with no access to water pools on the forest floor are going to be subjected to increasingly long dry periods, and therefore undoubtedly they will start being negatively affected by global climate changes. My colleagues and students and I have done some work where we've done transplants of epiphyte mats from areas very rich in mist and fog and moved them to trees where they're subject to lower mist and fog, and we found for all 4 target species that they declined. So this is sort of a canary in the coal mine in some ways, that these epiphytic plants, as lichens here in the temperate zone, can be sort of harbingers of hardships to come, something that we should keep in mind in terms of global climate change effects on different kinds or different components of our ecosystems. So that was just like a little slice of what I've done in the past couple of decades in terms of canopy research. I would like to say that there's growing interest in the forest canopy. We no longer think of forests as being chopped off at the top, but these little red donuts are the major forest canopy research sites that exist around the world. So we're learning more and more about the forest canopy, not only its composition and its structure, but also its ecological roles and its vulnerability to human and natural changes. So it's a very exciting time to be involved with forest canopy research. However, it's also a very depressing time to be involved with forest canopy research and forest research in general, because there are so many negative human effects that are going on in terms of deforestation, fragmentation, isolation of individual trees, gold mining in this case right here in Papua New Guinea that of course negatively affects the forest. And that, coupled with what I see as a increasing distance of humans from nature, I think and all of these things are very alarming to me in terms of wanting to maintain and enhance that beautiful tapestry of primary forests. So when people are faced with this kind of environment where they have very little or no contact with the wonders of nature and the values of nature, and most importantly the ecosystem values of nature, and especially the younger generation that are now having more virtual experiences than real experiences in terms of intimacy with the natural world, I began thinking about, wow, what can I as a scientist do about this? Sure, it's great to know all about this stuff in the forest canopy and obscure forests of Costa Rica, but what can I do to try to bring together the sense of humans and their closeness and dependence on nature? And being a forest ecologist and a forest canopy researcher, I said, well, back in 1994, I can start a nonprofit group called the International Canopy Network, and I'm going to take this scientifically sound information that I and my colleagues have generated and put it into popular magazines, into National Geographic media, into what we have a quarterly newsletter called What's Up, and try to work with the media to get this information out as quickly as we can. And for the first few years, I thought, wow, I'm really doing a great thing here in terms of spreading my scientific knowledge and providing it for these other parts of society. But what I realized pretty quickly is that the kinds of products, the kinds of pathways I was choosing was getting to people like this, people like myself, people like you guys probably if you came to this lecture, people who already understand the importance of trees and forests, already know of the wonder and the complexity and the fragility of the tapestry of our forest ecosystems. And so it seemed to me then that I needed to do something else. And let's see if I have this here. Yeah. Is Treetop Barbie there? Hello? Oh, something happened to Treetop Barbie, but I'll show you her here. So what we decided to do was to create Treetop Barbie. dressed in my sort of field clothes, get little helmets and so forth. And what we did was we first contacted Mattel, because we thought they would love this idea. They'll be able to sell Treetop Barbies and inspire young women all over the world because they're this amazing, everybody knows who Barbie is. So I called them, and it turned out for some reason they were not interested in Treetop Barbie. I can't understand it. So we said, well, we can do this ourselves. So now what we do is we go out to Deseret Industries, we go out to Savers, we buy used Barbies, we have a volunteer seamstress who makes her little clothes, and we get the little helmets on eBay. What's most important is this. This is a little handbook that we have that is a field guide to canopy plants of the Pacific Northwest, and that handbook goes out with Treetop Barbie when we sell them, and so Barbie herself then becomes an ambassador to this population of 6 or 7-year-old girls and some boys, so that they understand that not only can a young woman be a great, wonderful, adventurous, strong treetop explorer, but that she values the scientific information that goes along with climbing trees. Right now we're working on ground support Ken, but he doesn't seem to have quite the appeal that Treetop Barbie has, so I don't know whether we're going to be able to work on that. But anyway, that was sort of an example of how I started thinking about synergism, how I could start thinking about not just providing canopy, forest canopy, and forest ecosystem information to people who already know about forests and how great they are, but rather to link the ecological values of trees, which I've just talked to you about, trees and forest canopy organisms, to other parts of society. For instance, the spiritual, religious aspect of society. Many people are very religious. They go to church on Saturday or Sunday. They spend time, they tithe. They really value that spiritual and religious part of their lives, as they should. And is there a way to somehow link those spiritual religious values to the ecological values of trees? How about aesthetic values? We know that trees and forests are very beautiful. Can we link somehow with working with artists the ecological values of trees to the aesthetic values of trees? How about social justice values? Many of us feel very strongly about justice in our society. How can we link ecological values to those values? So what I'd like to do in this next section of the talk is to simply describe to you some of the projects and programs that my students and colleagues and I have done to link ecological values, that little balloon up there, with these other societal values. Let's start with spiritual and religious values. Hermann Hesse, the great German writer, said, I think very wisely, nothing is holier, nothing is more exemplary than a beautiful, strong tree. So nothing is holier than a tree. And I began exploring this by trying to explore this question. This was not easy for me to do, being a Hindu Jew. There's not a lot of scriptures that sort of encompass both of those traditions, but we do know about the Bible, for instance. And if you open your Old Testament up to the very first page, to the second verse of the first chapter, you learn about two very important trees, right? You learn about Are you guys Hindu Jews? No, I think there are probably some people who have read the Bible here, and one of them is the tree of life, and the other is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So right there you get kind of the importance of trees as symbols or as elements of how we come to think of ourselves in a spiritual context in the world. And I began taking this a little further by actually trying to look for all of the verses that had to do with trees and forests in the Old Testament and in other holy scriptures. So I downloaded the Old Testament from the web, and I did a search for the word tree and forest. And then, being a scientist, of course, I started categorizing all these different verses. So here's the percent of the citations. This is how many related to symbolic and aesthetic use, analogies to life and God, practical use like food and shade and so forth, location descriptions, how trees are used as locators in biblical regions and so forth. Tree loss is bad in tree biology. And you can see then that there's quite an interesting distribution. And the other thing that I can point out is that trees are really part of this culture. They're used for all kinds of very, very important things. So my conclusion, having looked at this one religious text, is that trees are very valuable to humans. And so I started going through the Talmud, the Jewish texts, the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scriptures, Buddhist writings, the Quran. I looked at some of the Native American cultures and some of the Eastern religions. And in each case, I was able to find lots and lots of examples of how trees and forests relate to the most basic needs of people. And so what I was able to do was to give lectures, give sermons actually in a number of churches and synagogues and temples. The Unitarians were the ones who invited me in first, as you might imagine. But after that, I was sort of passed around from Episcopalians to Catholics to Buddhists to Hindus to Muslims, and I was able to sort of give a package sermon about how trees and forests really figure into the spiritual and religious life of all the world's religions. I then offered, sort of coincidentally, that if anybody wanted to hear more about the ecological values of trees, I was happy to share those. But this was a case where I really wanted to look at the source, another source, not an academic source, not a scientific source, but a religious source to come to understand how humans and trees interact. I'm also very interested in that second bubble, the aesthetic, the artistic. How do we link science and art? How do we draw upon what is very natural to many, many people, that is seeing the beauty of a piece of forest or a single tree, and relate that, again, to the scientific or aesthetic values. So it's kind of an easy sell. I mean, trees and forests have been inspiring artists forever, I think, and so one of the things that I carried out were what I call Canopy confluences. These were week-long sessions where we went to a piece of primary forest. We've done this both in the tropics and in the temperate regions. We camp out for a week, and the week consists of a number of forest ecologists, but also visual artists, musicians, poets, creative writers, and we spend this week together climbing trees, going into the forest canopy together. I teach everybody how to climb using my mountain climbing techniques, and we spend just great time in the forest trying to understand with our tools and approaches, but also taking on the tools and approaches and perceptions of people who are not us, who the scientists, the artists try to explain, the artists take on what the scientists try to explain. And one of the things that came out of this was a wonderful modern dance called Biome. I worked with a modern dance troupe from San Francisco called Capacitor. Jody Lomask was the artistic director. She called me up and she said, "Nailini, I really want to do a dance on rainforest." So I said, "You've come to the right person and the right place. Let's go down to Costa Rica." So we spent 10 days together, her troupe and me and my students. We had them climb trees and explore fig trees. They looked at and came to understand frogs and interactions and roots and microbes, insects in the forest canopy. And when they came back, they made this fabulous dance called Biome. And we have performed it in San Francisco and in Seattle, where I start out the performance with a 15-minute talk about the science of the forest, how fragile it is, how complex it is, and then Jody and her troupe carry on with the dance that she does. And then in the lobby, after the dance and the speech is over, everybody files out, and in the lobby we have a number of booths where there are science education and conservation groups with opportunities to do volunteer work in local ecosystems or to sort of channel that inspiration and education into something useful there. We also brought musicians into the canopy who all sort of sat in the canopy platforms for long periods of time and then created music on the guitar, on wooden flute, and oboe. But the best piece of music, I think, was actually a piece of music by a young student of mine, Duke Brady, who made this really cool rap song, and I'll just play you a little piece of it.
Look up, expand your perspective. Don't put heavy, don't be so selective. Just another minute and I will leave you alone. Try walking a mile in a different biome.
And of course, when I go out to primary and secondary schools to give a talk about canopies, the kids always love this song more than anything I say. And that inspired me then to start a program I called Sound Science, where we capitalized on the fact that the kids really love the rap music, and if a rap singer can sort of partner with me as a scientist, we can convey both science and the art that goes along with the rap music. So we hired this rap singer who, his name is Caution. He's an ex-con. He's since gotten his undergraduate degree. We took him and 40 kids from Tacoma out to the forest. He would pick up a branch and start rapping on it, and then of course the kids did too, and I was sort of left in the dust as the middle-aged, frumpy professor, providing little bits of information. But it was really successful, and one of the things that we did was just excite them about what they were seeing because of their interest in the rap and hip-hop music that Caution was kind of the king of. We brought them in the afternoons into our sound studios, and so the kids got into groups, and with the help of Caution, they started making their own rap songs, and then at the end of the week, we cut the CD for them that they could take back to their family and friends at home, so that they were interpreting what was important and cool and interesting about the environment, about the biology, using their own medium, using their own cultural kind of cues and music to bring that home with them, and I think that was really great. The last thing I'd like to talk about in terms of this matching of values is the matching of social justice values with ecological values. And this is a program I started 5 years ago called the Sustainable Prisons Project. The idea actually started when I was feeling great concern about mosses. If you remember that picture I had with the bald guy, and you remember how long did it take for those mosses to grow back? Like 2 or 3 decades to grow back. Well, it turns out in the Pacific Northwest there is a big and growing industry, what is called secondary forest production, of harvesting mosses from old growth forests, from the trunks and branches of these old growth trees for the horticulture trade. So when you go into a florist shop and you buy a pot of, flowers with some moss, 95% of the mosses of world forests comes from old growth forests like this, harvested with these unsustainable techniques. And because of the important roles that we also established during my talk that these epiphytes play in the forest as a whole, it is of great concern that people are pulling them off and harvesting them for economic reasons in a non-sustainable way. So again, I'm not very powerful as a person in society, but I felt that there was something I could do as a botanist and as someone who knows about mosses, and that is I could learn how to grow these things. I could learn how to grow and farm these mosses, so that would reduce the collection of these mosses from the wild and reduce that collection pressure. Well, in trying to sort of set out on that, I realized I needed a lot of help. I needed people who had a lot of time, who had space, and it seemed to me that prisoners would be great collaborators in this because they have a lot of time and they have a lot of space. You don't need sharp tools to work with mosses, and sure enough, this worked. So I approached a number of prisons, met a couple of, who the heck are you? This sort of professor coming to prisons. But one of the prisons nearby, my home institution, the Cedar Creek Correction Center, it turned out the superintendent was quite open-minded, and he said, well, if you want to give it a try, have at it. So my students and I collected mosses. We brought them to the prison. We taught the inmates how to tell the different species of mosses apart. They ended up creating with us and helping with a study design of a study that looked at 4 species of mosses. We watered them with different regimes, fertilized them with different regimes in an effort to understand how can we best farm mosses. They were fabulous collaborators. They were very eager to participate in all of the work that went along with this. One of the inmates who took a special interest actually is the first author on a scientific paper in a peer-reviewed journal that came out 2 years ago. So this really had a positive scientific impact, as well as offering science to a population of people who are denied access because of legal reasons, and their past actions are denied access not only to science but to nature as well. And so our Sustainable Prisons Project now has engaged 5 prisons in Washington State. We have a full monthly science and sustainability lecture series that we have instituted. We've brought in sustainability experts, so now they've consulted and actually helped implement the putting in of organic gardens, composting, beekeeping, recycling, water catchment, essentially sort of turning around the idea that prisons are dark black holes that are a waste of money and a waste of humanity, and instead saying, no, actually, they can be model institutions in terms of living sustainably. We also took it a step farther by involving some agency scientists with some of the projects that they were having problems with. In Washington State, the Oregon spotted frog, which you see here, is nearly extinct. The Nature Conservancy and the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife has an ongoing project now with captive rearing these frogs and then putting them out in protected wetlands in order to bring these endangered populations up. So we invited the prisoners of Cedar Creek Correction Center to also be a participant in this program. So now they are rearing about 120 of these endangered frogs each year. They just got the award for the best captive rearing institution in Washington State because of the care that they take and the time that they have and the sense of contribution that they gain in terms of contributing to maintaining the biodiversity of our planet, and rightly so. We have a project now in conjunction with the Nature Conservancy of raising 300,000 plugs of endangered prairie plants that are then taken by the TNC and planted out, again, in protected areas. We just started a program with the women's prison to raise the endangered butterfly, the tailored checker spot, and so that's in its first year, and we anticipate that that's going to go very well. This has all kind of been a tremendous attraction for the media, so we've had lots of media attention from Science down to PBS television and Playboy magazine. If you want to pull out that October 2010 issue that you have stashed somewhere, you can read about this prison project as well. And I laugh at that, but I think it's significant in terms of synergism, because although scientists are sort of trained to publish in scientific journals and communicate with their scientific peers, there is also a benefit of communicating in those kinds of these kinds of outlets, in that the general public comes to understand the importance of science, the wonder of science, and might then participate more in the stewardship and the protection of scientific support to maintain that tapestry of science as well. What I'm doing now is I've established what I call the Research Ambassador Program, which is funded by the National Science Foundation, and it is an effort to take this kind of approach of scientist-based outreach, synergistic public outreach to other scientists. It's not just me that can do this stuff, it's any of you scientists, any of you academics actually, in terms of just kind of rethinking where could this information that I've just captured in my research, where can it go? How can I shape it so that it will fit, it will link with, it will be synergistic with some of the other societal values that exist out there, and in doing so provide some sort of input and output, some sort of tapestry interweaving in terms of what we give and get from society. I think this approach comes none too soon. John Holdren, who's the President's Advisor for Science, recently said that scientists should tithe 10% of our professional time and effort to increase the benefits of science for the human condition. So I think what he's saying here is that the condition of the biosphere is such that we really, and society is such that we can't just sit in our little labs doing our little work, that we have to think about how it might benefit humankind. So to end up, I just want to mention that right now I'm the new director for the Center for Science and Math Education. So I'll be doing more than just my own research in the canopies and my own outreach. I'm going to now be trying to guide and provide a vision for the Center of Science and Math Education and Engagement, so that we collectively at the University of Utah can bring some of the vast amounts of threads of information that are produced by our scientists and mathematicians and weave that into society, whether it's K-12 or whether it's the university itself or whether it's the public. So those are the kinds of things that we're really trying to do. So just to complete this sort of thought and tie this together, I guess I feel, even as I speak and as I listen to myself, I feel, wow, have I ever been a lucky person, a lucky hardworking person, but a lucky person nonetheless, in terms of being able to pursue the questions that I kind of feel in my heart, that I started as a little child to wonder what's going on in trees and climbing up there. And I've been able to kind of garner the tools of communication and of science to do that. And it has led me to understand that the forest itself is a complex tapestry, that I'm one of the threads that move through it, but there are lots and lots of other ways of understanding and appreciating something like this. And I guess I would say, speaking to mostly younger people here, mostly students I'm presuming, is that I guess I'm able to do this because I did pursue with great energy what I was interested in, what I was passionate about, and that there were trees in my heart when I kind of started out with this. And actually this is a picture of a human heart, and if you look as I do at it, you can see that there are trees in all of our hearts. But I want to end with a thought, which is that you know, maybe you have other things in your hearts besides trees. And I really encourage you to distill, to understand, and to articulate what those things are in your heart, so that now, as students in this wonderful university, and with the resources that you have, not just here, but all around this great state, that you too can pursue what you want in your heart. It will take work, just as it did for me. It will take a long time. I mean, I'm pretty old right now, and I get to do these things, but I really urge you to look for that, to look for what's in your heart, and to pursue it. Thank you very much.